Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to episode 2 of LightBytes, big subject, bite-sized, brought to you by Training Bytesize. So, as we said last week, in our first few sessions, we're going to be looking at some key topics from the APM PMQ syllabus. And today we are looking at budgets, costs, and earned value management. But just before I go on to hand you over to our fantastic trainer for the afternoon, I'm just going to say a little bit about who we are at Training Bytesize and what we do. We are a family-owned and run business based in Cheshire, and we are a leading provider of APM training and, of course, all different kinds of project management, program management, and IT service management training. We offer a range of qualifications from foundations all the way up to chartered status. And we offer a variety of ways to study. So whether that's face-to-face, online self-paced learning, or on-site if you're training teams, or a blended combination of various methods. We take absolute pride in providing a fantastic service and a fantastic training experience to every one of our learners, whether you're taking a qualification on your own or you're part of a big corporate team. You're all individuals to us. So before I hand over to Callum, I'm just going to introduce him. The trainer for today is Callum Downing. He is a specialist APM trainer with over 12 years in project management training and consulting. And it's absolutely fantastic to have him lead our session today. So that's enough from me. I'm going to hand you over to Callum.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jake. Yeah, so my name's Callum. Welcome to session 2 or episode 2. So today we're going to start off with talking about budgeting. Just a very quick overview of budgeting, because I think the one that everyone sort of wants to talk about is EVM and value management. We'll talk about in a second, but we'll start with budgeting because I think it sets up EVM a little bit. So effectively, a budget is just figuring out how much money you want to spend on a project. That's it. I think there's no surprises with that. It's working out the total budget overall. That's going to be done from the business case through to the project management plan, working out a justified and credible cost for the project. Working out also based on this lump of money, most projects, if not all projects, will not spend their money either right at the end or right at the start. They'll be spending their money throughout. So the budget is going to be working out when in the schedule we're going to spending the money. There'll be an estimate, there'll be forecast, there'll be management of actual costs against that budget and all sorts. But you'll often see a budget looking like that, an S-curve. It's very rare that a project is going to be a straight line. That's going to throw things off a little bit when I talk about EVM, because I will use straight line examples just to illustrate EVM, but most projects in reality will be an S-curve. They have a slow start and then they ramp up when things kick off. And then as the project winds down again, they kind of peter to a stop. And what we're doing with our budget is looking at our actuals and then trying to forecast, are things going as expected? Does the actuals meet our budget, our planned budget? Does our forecast marry up with our future plans? So budgets are split into 3 sections. We have something called the base cost estimate, or known scope, it can be known as. And effectively, this is all our planned costs, our expected costs, such as salaries for people, human resources, accommodation, material costs, equipment costs, capital items. So overall resources we are expecting to spend money on. That's the base cost estimate or known scope. Then we have another part of the budget set aside called contingency. Contingency is for identified or known risk. I like to refer to it as known unknowns myself. So these are risks we predict. We have a risk register for them, and then we have ways to respond to risk, and those responses will usually require money. We have a contingency fund to supply those responses with some cash without having to dip into our base cost estimate to ask or ask our sponsor or financer for more money to manage the risk. We already have the money set aside in contingency. And then the last part is management reserve, which is for unknown unknowns. So risks that we couldn't have predicted, something that has either extremely low likelihood of occurring, but would massively impact the project if it did happen, or risks we simply couldn't predict. So things like, not to kind of beat on a an old horse now, but COVID, for example, I know some organizations rapidly had to respond to this COVID situation and people working from home all of a sudden by buying loads of laptops for staff. They may have used the management reserve to fund the laptops, because if they use the management reserve, it's also a pot of money set aside that's part of the budget. So if we keep things within the management reserve, then we have a pot of money just in case, which means we wouldn't have to ask the business for more money on top of what we've already asked for. So base cost estimate, contingency, and management reserve all comprise the budget. So they all need to be considered at the start of the project and through our planning. How much contingency and management reserve is depends entirely on the organization. Most organizations will have different attitudes to risk, and the attitude to risk will dictate how much we set aside for contingency and management reserve. So when we're kind of budgeting, when we're working at our cost controls, there's a few financial terms that get bandied around. The first of which is actual cost. So this is money we've actually spent, so money that's no longer in my bank account. I've paid it. It's in my contractor's bank account. So I've paid the money. It's actual cost. It's a historic payment. Accrued costs are payments owed. So work has been done, or something has been completed or is on its way that has yet to be paid. So for example, I always think of walls when I think of this stuff. I think of this walls a lot with budgeting and project earned value management. I look outside my window and I see that my builder I've hired to build a wall has built the wall for me. I owe him money or her money. It's done. They haven't invoiced me. The builder hasn't invoiced me yet, but I can see that I'm going to need to pay it at some point because I can see the work has been done. So it's money owed. Committed cost is a legally binding cost. So it's money that we've contractually agreed to spend. So it doesn't matter if the one I think of here is mobile phones. If we are in a two-year contract with a mobile phone, we pay £20 a month, let's say, for a mobile phone bill. I could throw the phone in the bin. It wouldn't make any difference. I'm still contractually obliged to pay that £20 a month for that phone. So it's legally agreed to be paid. So it's a future payment that has yet to be paid, but it's contractually going to have to be paid. And the estimate to complete, or planned cost, it could be known as well, but estimate to complete is the formal term, is costs we have predicted that they're not contracted. We expect to pay them, but if we needed to, we could cancel them. They're not legally agreed. They're future costs that are not legally agreed to be paid. So on the next slide, I've got a very, very simple diagram that just shows the dotted line in the middle says now, that's where we currently are. Actual costs are historic payments. Accrued costs are goods have been received historically, but the payment is still outstanding. Committed costs are future costs that have to be paid. An estimate to complete is future costs that are not legally agreed to be paid. So that's very much all that is with budgeting. It's if you're kind of going with the PMQ, there's only a few high-level things you need to remember, mostly buzzwords if you're thinking PMQ here, if you're thinking qualification. When you look at real projects, so you'll often find this cumulative S-curve in them, going back to that first slide a moment ago. Cumulative totals is our overall cost at a point in time. So we don't have a bar chart with costs generally. We have a S-curve, which is cumulative costs throughout the project. And that will give us an idea of the shape of our budget throughout our project. And that will tie into our schedule quite closely, that would. So it doesn't have to be every month like it is here. It could be when a milestone has been achieved, we pay somebody. If we put that in our schedule, then we know our budget would reflect that schedule. And it will show the rate of spend. It allows you to analyze trends and show where things are going. And a graph can be very helpful to visualize and help to forecast as well. Hence why we often use graphs to show the budgets. As I said, that's pretty much it for budgeting. That's it. Very, very short one on that one. So questions, I guess.
Wow, fantastic. I mean, budgeting is certainly one of those things that's been that's certainly kind of on all of our minds at the moment, isn't it? Just even at a personal level. Fantastic. So in terms of budgets, Callum, I had a brief question. What are some of the different ways that one can set a budget? I mean, I know we've looked at kind of the management reserve and so on, but I'm just wondering, are there any particular methods you've come across in your work where, that would decide a budget? Is it to do with company size or company governance, or?
Well, that's a question, Jake. It depends really. So it can be how much money have we got. It could be down to, say, company size or the type of investment they have. So we have £100,000 left over from last year. Let's invest in a project. That could dictate the budget. Generally speaking, when we're talking business cases, budgets and business cases, there should be some estimating going on. So, for example, where I come from in defence, it'd often be looking at other projects, so other countries' projects or previous projects we'd worked on to get an idea. So, for example, I used to work in the air. I used to support the RAF with my projects, and if the RAF wanted a new plane, they'd look at the Americans and say, right, how much did their plane cost? We want that kind of plane, and then we get an idea of how much we should be spending on our aircraft. So you can compare to similar projects, but it could be how much money we've got left. It could be this is very cynical of me, but it could just be a finger in the air going, I think it will cost about £10,000. But generally speaking, how it should work, if we're going to be really sensible about it, is in our business case, we want to compare and try and do as many estimates as possible, as much estimating as possible, comparing to similar projects or past experiences or lessons learned registers from other projects, and then giving us an idea for our business case, our budget and our business case, which will be fairly high level. A business case budget, or the budget we have in a business case, will very rarely be, this is when I expect to spend money. But the project management plan, where we start building up our breakdown structure, so our cost breakdown structure, which is based on a work breakdown structure, will start giving you a lot of detail around how much we're going to spend. And at the end of the project management plan, that should, if we've broken our project down into our detailed scope, and which is based on our detailed requirements, that will then help us to build that credible budget. And if we use the work breakdown structure and cost breakdown structure, that will also help build a really good schedule, which again helps to define our budget. So we know when we're spending money. So long answer to the question there, but effectively, yeah, that's how it should work. Reliable estimates at the start, and then breaking them down more detail as we go.
No, that's a great answer. And just to kind of follow up on that, it seems to me that that sounds to me like an estimating funnel, doesn't it? If we're going to look at that in kind of, in BOK terms, in BOK7 terms, it's there is a funnel where you start with your subjective estimate, you then end up with your analogous estimate, what planes the Americans have, then you move on to your kind of parametric, and then finally your kind of analytical, where you've got the kind of ultimate cost and work breakdown structure, where you can actually, get into the real meat of it. I mean, that just seems to be, in theoretical terms, it has that nice kind of funnel shape about it that gets more accurate as you go along.
Precisely, and that's just why we should be estimating throughout the project, is because it gets more accurate. It doesn't have to be we do analogous at the start and then we don't use it again. We can use analogous later on, because we might find information that goes, actually the project we first used isn't as reliable as this new project we found. But yeah, it's just about, and that's why we do it. And if we follow that estimating funnel, since you brought it up, that will help should help refine our budget. Yeah.
Fab. I've got a couple of other really great questions here. One here that just says, is it best to estimate the contingency on a case-by-case basis, on a case-by-case risk, or just as a percentage of the estimated cost?
It really depends on the organization. So my experiences generally are organizations will have appetites for risk. They'll say, in this company, so you mentioned governance a minute ago. Our organization, for example, one organization might say, right, our risk appetite dictates that we have a 15% contingency for all our projects, and that's just company-wide. However, some companies might say we want a bit more flexibility with our projects, and it's going to be a project by project basis. So they'll look at the environment the project's working in, they'll look at the requirement of the project, and then they'll base their contingency off of that requirement and how much risk we want that project to be open to taking. Because the reality is, the phrase I always think of is high risk, high reward. If we take more risk, we'll have more reward. So if we have a bigger contingency budget, we'll have more opportunity, more money to take opportunities. Equally, if you're putting a huge contingency budget set aside, then it's money that's just going to potentially just sit there. And organizations can be a little bit reluctant to hand over tons of cash, which is just effectively just in case, really. But it is a case, it does depend on the organization. So it can be case by case, but I would generally say most big organizations certainly will have a set contingency percentage, I would say.
Great. Okay, so I've got another couple of questions here, which I can kind of wrap up into one meatier question. So the question is, what percentage levels of contingency would be advisable, or does it depend on the project? And essentially the same question for unknown unknowns.
Yeah, so for management reserve, it depends. So again, most companies will decide on the percentage. So I would say, If I'm being really project management-y, I would say it's case by case, and it depends on the project. So again, if we give a very large project a 15% contingency, that's going to be a lot of money potentially, and some organizations might balk at spending that money. But equally, they might, I mean, for example, MOD, if I recall, it's been a while, I think it was about 15% contingency in MOD, if I recall. Might have been 10 to 15%, I think is usually fairly common. But I know some companies I've worked with have done 25% contingency. So it does depend, and it can be project by project. It's a tricky one. There's no definitive answer to that one, I'm afraid, simply because it depends on the organization. It depends on their appetite for risk. And the same with management reserve. You don't tend to find very large management reserves, maybe sort of 5% generally, I would say, if not less. But again, some organizations might say we're working in an extremely volatile environment with extremely new technology. We need a large management reserve because we don't know what's going to happen. So they might say we want a 10% contingency and a 10% management reserve as well. It depends. It really does depend on the nature of the organization, the environment, the project they're working on, all sorts of things. So there's no straight, clear cut, this is the answer, I'm afraid, for those ones.
Yes, no, it's funny you mentioned that, and I kind of smiled as you said the word volatile, because my brief kind of follow up to that was, so if we're in a very if we're in a volatile environment, then there's of course a higher risk for unknown unknowns. So maybe wanting to manage that accordingly. No, that's a great answer. Okay, so we've had some really great questions there. I am conscious that I want to make sure we get through everything we can in the session for all of you. So what we're going to do is I'm going to hand back over to Callum and move on.
So this is what I think everyone's here to see is EVM, value management. So EVM, right. So I'm going to bring up a few slides. I'll talk through a few of them. Some of them are kind of just there for information. But effectively, this is how EVM begins. This is a very kind of, on the left-hand side, you have your scoping and scheduling process over there. And then it has some arrows and some indicators of how it works with value management. So to simplify that diagram a little bit, value management tracks progress of the project based on time and cost, so schedule and budget. So that's why budgeting is part of this. So that diagram there tries to describe how schedule and budget kind of fall into value management, the information we need. It goes back to that question Jake asked a minute ago regarding how we get a detailed budget. We get a detailed budget by breaking down our project into parts, which are those breakdown structures. So I'm going to just start with a very brief analogy that my boss I used to work with in MOD gave me, and I think it helped me really get my head around value management. I've used it in a couple of content and things like that because I just find it really helpful. Is a sat nav. I imagine most of you use sat navs in your cars. EVM is a very similar kind of tool to a sat nav. So if you input into your sat nav, I live near Bath. I want to go to Birmingham, which is about a 3-hour drive. If I plan to set off at 1, I will plan to arrive at 4 o'clock. So that's my plan. That's the gray line there. So the PC stands for plan cost. Don't worry about the others for now. So that gray line on the graph now stands for plan cost. So that's my plan. I plan to leave at 1. It takes 3 hours. I plan to arrive at 4. And this is prior to setting off. You type it into your sat nav. It will show you where you're going to go. That's your plan. As you're driving, certain things might happen. So for example, if you get stuck in traffic, it will look at your progress. It'll say, you're not as far ahead on your journey as I thought you would be at this point in time. I'll adjust that time of arrival to be 5 o'clock instead, based on the fact you're not as far ahead on your journey as I thought you would be at this point in time. And it will then say, right, you're arriving at 5 o'clock then. EVM does the same thing, or it can do the same thing. It can say, right, this is the situation. Let's extrapolate that out and predict and give you a prediction about where this will end if things continue like this. How long will the project take and how much money will it cost if things continue like this? The other thing it can do is you type into your sat nav and say, right, I think I might take an alternative route then. What would the alternative route do for me? So you say, rather than staying on the M5 trying to get to Birmingham, I'll take a side road. And the side roads, and if you take the side road, it's the ETA, the estimated time of arrival, will be 4:30. So it's not as good as the 4 o'clock I planned to arrive at originally, but it's better than arriving at 5 o'clock if I stayed on that road. So EVM does the same thing. It says, takes a snapshot of where you are at the current point in your project and says, based on where we are, how are things doing? If things continue like this, where will they go? And then you as a project manager with a project team of experts will say, right, am I happy to stay on the M5, stay on this route and see what happens? Or do I take an alternative, and what the implications, what the impact of that alternative option to my project? How much more money will it cost? What resources will I need? What changes the scope do I need to do? What risks would I take if I take another route to try and bring it back to my plan? So EVM is a sat nav for your project, pretty much. That's an analogy I've been using for a little while now. So this graph here, there's some acronyms. There is a glossary in this slide pack as well, just to kind of capture these terms for you. But we have a few terms down the side there. We've got planned costs, also known as planned value or budgeted cost of work scheduled. I tend to go with planned value myself, but they're all interchangeable terms, all means the same thing. Then we have earned value or budgeted cost of work performed. Again, I always just call it earned value to keep things simple. And then the blue dotted line is actual cost or actual cost of work performed. So that's your actual cost we were talking about a minute ago with budgets. So this is a simple graph. And the way to look at it is this. We have our planned cost line there in gray, and then we have our earned value in orange and our actual costs in blue. If our earned value line is sitting, what we do is with earned value management, we want to compare the earned value with the planned cost or planned value, depending on what you want to call it, or we compare the earned value with the actual cost. If we compare the earned value with the planned cost, it will indicate how we're doing in terms of schedule. If we compare the earned value with our budget, our actual cost rather, it will tell us how we're doing in terms of cost. So for example, this orange line on this graph is above the planned cost line, which tells me that we're coming in ahead of schedule. The orange line is also above the blue dotted line, which tells me we're coming in under budget. So the way I think of it is this: earned value is how much of our product have we earned? How much of our thing have we earned? If I think of a wall, for example, if I plan to spend £1,000 on this wall, I expect to receive £1,000 worth of wall at the end of the project. And then I can track progress based on that. So if I've done 25% of my wall, then that would be, in terms of money, £250 worth of wall. If my 100% of my wall is worth £1,000 to me. So that term value means how much money is it worth to me, and how much money is it worth to me is how much do I plan to spend on it at the end, effectively. So that's your budget at completion. The BAC is your budget at completion, and then the OD down the bottom is original duration. Again, there is a glossary with all these in there. Let me just use a different graph to show you. So here's our project. We have 4 rooms we need to do, and the project is going to take 4 weeks, so 1 room per week, with a total planned cost or budget at completion of £200 at the end of week 4. After week 1, we finished 2 rooms, and we've spent £60 per room. So we've done rooms 1 and 2 in week 1 and spent £60 for each of those rooms. So again, earned value management then looks at this and says, if we've spent £60 per room, but we've done 2 rooms, it will help to answer these 2 questions. So we've done 2 rooms in 1 week, so we're ahead of schedule, but we've spent £60 per room rather than £50 per room, which means we're coming in over budget. So if things continue like this, we'll finish the project within 2 weeks rather than 4, and we'll have to spend another £40 on top of our planned cost being £200. If we continue like this, we'll spend £240. So it's predicting ahead, it's forecasting what's going to happen. So here's just a few terms. Okay, there's a breakdown of a few of those terms there. Okay, as I said, there is a separate slide with all these terms in. These are the acronyms. Now, just to reassure everyone, you do not need to remember all the acronyms. If you're thinking of taking the project management qualification, you don't need to remember all these acronyms. There's a cheat way of kind of getting around some of these a little bit, which I'll talk about in a sec. So those are a few terms. I'm not going to go through all of them on the slide, but there are a few terms just to reassure you. So if you want to watch this back, all the information is all on here for you. The one that I know has caused confusion before is the PC and PV, planned cost and planned value. The reason is because I've seen in some of the study guides and textbooks, on one page it says planned cost, on the next page it says planned value. They are interchangeable. They mean the same thing. Okay. So this is a graph showing the same thing. So showing this project. So there's our project as a graph with a line. So £50 after week 1, etc., up to a £200 budget at completion. So that's my overall planned cost there, £200. And that's where we currently are, the end of week 1. So at the end of week 1, we had a planned cost of £50 at the end of week 1. There's our actual cost. So our actual cost is £120 because we spent £60 per room. and the orange line is my earned value. So I've earned £100 of room at the end of week 1 because I've done 2 rooms. My original plan, each room was worth £50 each. I've done 2 rooms. There were 2 rooms based on my original plan worth £100 to me. Therefore, I'm earning value quicker than I expected to. So I should have received £100 worth of rooms at the end of week 2. Instead, I've received £100 worth of rooms at the end of week 1. So again, going back to my original, when I said earlier on about the graph, if we compare these lines again, so if we compare our earned value, the orange line to our grey line, that's above the grey line, which tells me I'm ahead of schedule. However, if I compare my earned value with my actual cost, so if I compare the orange line with the blue line, that tells me that I'm spending more money than I planned to. So I've had to get £100 worth of rooms, I've had to spend £120 to get it. So I'm coming in over budget. And with a graph, going back to budgeting again a little bit here, we can predict ahead. And this is what earned value management is incredibly useful for. So we can extrapolate it out and it will tell me how much longer it's going to take to get the full project done. So at the end of week 2, I will receive £200 worth of rooms. Therefore, that's when it finishes. However, to get that £200 worth of rooms, I'm going to need to spend £240 to get it. So we can use those lines to extrapolate out and give us a forecast to predict ahead. So graphs tend to be more how earned value management gets portrayed to people in the workplace. It doesn't in the exam, and it doesn't always get shown as this. It could be shown as numbers, which I'll show you in a second. But graphs are visual. They help predict. They can analyze trends. Again, budgets in reality will be an S-curve. It works in exactly the same way. So you just take snapshots at different points in your project. We say, right, we want to take a snapshot of our earned value progress here. Let's extrapolate this out. And you use a graph to show the trend. So you look at the trend, the shape of the graph so far. Is the shape of our earned value following that graph, or is it completely different? If it's completely different, what does the trend indicate to us? Where is it going? So that's our forecast costs. Forecast schedule. So estimate at completion would be our forecast costs. Estimated completion duration is our forecast schedule based on value data. So here's just a few graphs, and this is kind of more for your benefit, I suppose, if you want to try and revise a bit of this or just recap some of this. Again, we're trying to compare the earned value lines. Sorry that the colors are different there. So we've got different colors here. The green line is, I believe, actuals now, and the earned value is blue. So the red line is planned, green is actual cost, and the earned value is blue for this one. Sorry to change the colors. So the red line is planned. Our earned value, the blue dotted line, is above both the green line and the red line, which shows me that I'm ahead of schedule and under budget. Well, there we go. There's a key for you. So the second project here, project B, this shows me my earned value is way above the schedule, the planned cost. So it's above the red line, which tells me I'm coming in ahead of schedule. It's also really above the green dotted line, which is how much I've actually spent, which is coming in really under budget, really under budget. We're very happy with that project. It's doing very well. Whereas this last project, the blue dotted earned value line is below both the red line and green line, which tells me that the project is coming in under schedule, behind schedule, based on comparing it to the red line there, and over budget because it's below the actual cost line. So graphs can be it's a very simple way to express it. These graphs, hopefully, is coming across simply. We compare the earned value line with the planned cost. That will tell me how we're doing in terms of schedule. We compare the earned value line with the actual cost. That will tell me how I'm doing in terms of budget. The ideal scenario is that all the lines are on the same, they all meet on the planned cost line. If they do, it tells me my estimates were exactly right. My plan we're experiencing my plan exactly as we expected it to be, which is kind of the ideal with a project, really. We want it to be following the plan exactly. But in this instance, project C, it's very behind schedule and very over budget as well. So just again, it can be shown as a table. So what you'll often find, this is more just to illustrate that percentage complete will often equate to earned value. It's just a case of how do we translate percentage complete into earned value? So how do we basically, because earned value management does not track percentage complete on the graphs. It tracks money. So we have to convert the percentage complete into a monetary value to be able to track it. This is the glossary slide. Okay, so this just goes through the terms. There's a few on here. So budgeted cost of work scheduled, actual cost of work performed, budgeted cost of work performed. I don't tend to use those myself. I tend to stick with the simplest ones. I just find them easier to remember. So planned cost, actual cost, earned value. But here's a glossary slide just to capture everything you, if you feel you need to remember it. But if you are thinking of doing the PMQ, I would say you don't need to worry too much about remembering all what the acronyms stand for. It's more what they are rather than what they actually stand for. Okay, so budget of completion is total cost at planned cost of completion. Estimate of completion is how much do I predict based on my earned value data. So this slide here, then, this is more for a exam point of view, because I think the burning question for many people is going to be, how does this work in an exam? So it's very unlikely in the PMQ exam they will use graphs to express EVM. What they'll typically do is use data such as this, and we have two kind of strands here. We've got schedule performance index, or SPI, and cost performance index. Quick way to remember this is anything with the letter S in front of it means schedule. Anything with the letter C in front of it means cost. Okay, so this is going to tell me the same information that a graph does, pretty much. So if the earned value line and the actual cost line are all on the planned cost line, if all the lines all overlap each other, that means things are going exactly as expected. That's indicated as a cost performance index or as a schedule performance index by the number 1. So if we have the number 1 in here, it tells me that things are going exactly as expected. If any of these, any performance index, so schedule or cost performance index, are a number below 1, that tells me things are going worse than expected. It's bad news. So for example, we got on month 1 there, it tells me, this graph or this table tells me I have a schedule performance index of 0.92, which tells me that it's not going very well. It should be 1. If it's 1, that means everything is going exactly as expected, but my schedule performance index is 0.92, which is less than 1, which tells me things are going worse than expected. However, my cost performance index is 1, which tells me that my budget is exactly as I expected at month 1. Month 2, my schedule performance index is 0.89, again below 1, which tells me things aren't very good in terms of schedule, but my cost performance index is above 1. So if with a performance index the number is above 1, it means that things are going better than planned. So for example, cost performance index is 1.02, which tells me that I'm actually under budget. I'm performing better with my budget than I originally, my plan said I would be. Month 3, though, we can see here, based on this goes back to this trend analysis, my schedule performance index is gradually getting worse. So it's getting further and further away from that 1 we're after. So by month 4, it's 0.77. So this is if you want to convert this into a percentage, by the way, it's 77%. So you just times this by 100 and you get your percentage performance as well, your percentage efficiency. So I'm running at 0.77 rather than 1, or 77% efficient rather than 100% efficient. So month 4, things are going really behind schedule. It's getting further and further behind schedule the further I'm getting, whereas my cost performance index seems to have gotten really quite good on month 3, and then sort of it's kind of coming back in on itself on month 4. So in the exam, in the PMQ, the sort of question you will get is perhaps an interpret question. So it will provide you some data, a bit like that, and say, right, based on this data, how is the project performing? So interpret this data. Tell me, based on this data, interpret this information, tell me how the project, or tell the examiner how the project is performing. And then it will ask you to go on and say, right, based on this performance, recommend some solutions and why you'd use them. So what does this mean? What would your solution be and why would you use it? So for example, this project, if it was just a very, very quick example here, this project is getting further and further behind schedule, but it looks to be getting further and further under budget. So it could be a relationship there. It could be we're spending less money because we're not buying the same amount of equipment at that point in time. So we plan to be further ahead on the project. We may not have had to buy the stuff we needed to buy because we're behind schedule, which means we have a surplus of cash potentially. So that might be a reason. I then need to think about what actions can I take to bring that back on track. Another one could be, for example, a very simple one even, would be that we've got loads of extra cash, let's buy some more resources. We've got surplus of cash, let's buy some more resources to make sure the project gets back on schedule. So we've got more money than we we're not spending money at the same rate we thought we would be. It could be another solution. This is a really good solution. I've seen this used in exams before, is do nothing. Take no action. We're happy for it to come in behind schedule and massively under budget, because the customer might be more inclined to get a cost saving than a time saving. So that could be another valid solution. So it's looking at this data and saying, kind of applying a bit of project management experience, or a bit of, not, I suppose, common sense in a way. What would you do if the project is behind schedule, or ahead of schedule, under budget, over budget, on budget, etc.? What would you do? And it's just a case of looking at that data and then telling the examiner what you do about it based on your interpretation of the data. So just a quick reminder, with a performance index, 1 is best because that shows we're meeting the plan exactly. That would be all the lines on a graph overlapping each other. Less than 1 is worse than expected. That would be where the earned value line is above both the planned line or the actual cost line. It's going worse than expected. If the number is greater than 1, it's going better than expected. We're ahead of schedule, or we're under budget, we're underspending. So that's kind of more of an exam point of view earned value management talk for that bit. Last bit then of earned value management, just so we've got time for questions, because I appreciate there might be a few. Advantages of it. Now there's a few here, there's actually loads, there's many advantages. There's a few straightforward ones here. So it's graphical, so it uses graphs, it uses data. As a result of using graphs, it's fairly easy to understand, easy to communicate. I'll come back to that one in a second actually. It is based on simple data, so we try and work out at the start of our project, during our project management plan, what data we're going to gather. I know companies like Airbus, for example, take averages of current spend and use that to evaluate earned value management. Indicates performance in terms of schedule and cost. So it's allowing you to track your project progress. It will then also estimate final duration and cost based on current performance. So it'll extrapolate out, it'll forecast where things are going if things continue. Identifies areas of sensitivity or risk, so based on things performing or underperforming or overperforming. What risks or opportunities might it introduce? And again, going back to my point about the sat-nav and say, you know what, let's take another route. There may be an opportunity to get there even quicker. You might find a new route that takes you less time than the original planned route. Equally, it might take you a little bit longer, but you know, you're willing to take that risk. So it'll help to identify those things a little bit. Say, what's the impact of going away from my original plan, or sticking to my original plan potentially? That's what it's effectively doing. So if I stay with my plan, if things continue as it is based on where we are, what would it look like? Or do I make a decision as a project manager and say, I want to do something different? What's the impact of doing another option? What's the impact of cost, time, quality, stakeholders, etc.? One of the things I found incredibly useful with earned value management is estimating problems. As I said earlier, it's if you have a number, if your project, if your earned value data, if your performance index or your cost schedule performance index, cost performance index or schedule performance index, sorry, are 1, that tells me my estimating is exactly right. My estimates have been perfect. They show exactly what I expected. My actuals and my performance is exactly as I expected it to be. That shows reliable estimating. It confirms that wherever I'm getting my estimates from is a reliable source of estimating. However, going back to this slide a second, the answer to this could simply be we've overestimated our schedule. It could be we've overestimated our schedule and underestimated our costs. So we don't need to spend as much money as we planned to. We need more time than we planned. So it highlights problems with estimating. It will kind of encourage you. Going back to Jake mentioned the estimating funnel. It's quite useful you mentioned that actually, because it's worth bringing up again. Your estimates should get better and better as you go through the project. Estimating funnels is sort of helping us to understand that at the start of our project, estimates will be very broad and quite unreliable. As we get more and more information, our estimates will get better. EVM is a way of checking those estimates are getting better, because if our durations of our schedule performance index or our graphs are getting wilder and wilder and wilder away from our original plan, it may not be poor project management, it may just simply be poor estimating. So we want to go back and re-estimate and say, right, based on current data, current information we've gathered, do we need to re-estimate our project? I found that incredibly useful in defense, where I would find problems with estimating, because to get business cases slipped through and approved, people were taking over-optimistic estimates, which we could go back and challenge later on based on the fact that everything's going exactly as expected, but why are we behind schedule all the time? Oh, it's because someone took an over-optimistic estimate in the business case, and actually this isn't realistic. So we can adjust our estimates to reflect what it's really going to look like based on the data we've gathered in EVM. Now, there are some considerations of it. It is a going back to that easy to understand, it's also incredibly complicated. It's easy to understand if you can kind of wrap your head around some of the basic principles of it. But on paper, it's certainly in textbooks, I think it can be quite intimidating. I think certainly if you're presented it in a project, I know many projects or organizations that have gone, oh, EVM, that's a hot topic right now, let's plug it into our project. And everyone's just gone, what's all this? What does all of these ones and zeros mean? 1.0 and 0.8, what does that all mean? I've actually been in meetings before where someone said, oh, we're a performance index of 0.8, and everyone's just gone, yeah, sounds all right, because no one has a clue what I'm on about. So it's easy to understand if you get the principles of it, but on paper, if you haven't sort of investigated it a little bit, it can be incredibly complicated just to throw into someone's face and say, right, use this. It doesn't work like that. It does require training. It does assume performance is linear. So again, most projects follow an S-curve. EVM will take a snapshot and predict based on a straight line. So we'd have to, again, think about that in relation to a graph. What's the trend showing? And use it in conjunction with our EVM data, because EVM will always predict in a straight line if we're using the performance indexes to predict ahead. And it's that last point there is based on financial data. It does not consider performance based on quality. So again, we have quality standards we need to meet. There's lots of things regarding quality and stakeholder expectations. Stakeholders may not be as worried about the time and cost as they are focused on achieving the scope or the quality standards. EVM is only tracking performance and predicting ahead based on time and cost, which means people can get a little bit lost in the, so again, investors might get a little bit interested in the cost side of things and less about the what we're actually getting at the end of it side of things. So it is only based on, well, not always, it can be based on financial data, which can cause people to think only financially when there's other things to consider in projects as well. Yeah, cool. I think that's it. Quick squiz through on value management there.
Fantastic. No, it's a really interesting topic, Callum. And I'm glad I brought up the estimating funnel now. Took me right back to my own APM training. Fantastic. Okay, so yes, please do ask all your questions. You can go to menti.com and pop in the code there, or you can use your smartphone to scan the QR code there, or quite simply, feel free to pop your questions into the Zoom chat. Okay, so just to kind of kick off with one here, Callum. So I've got a question here that just says, if you re-baseline your project for cost or schedule, do you recalculate? And if so, how would you document it?
Yes, you would need to recalculate, because if you re-baseline your project, you're effectively saying your plan, the original plan is no longer the plan we're using. We're using the re-baseline plan, which would mean you'd have to re-baselining your plan. If I assume re-baselining the budget as well as schedule, if you re-baseline those, that's your new plan, which means you'd have to re-baseline your own value stuff as well. How you document it in the project management plan somewhere. Specifically, it depends on the system you're using to manage value management. But for example, in defense, we used to have a Excel spreadsheet based on the schedule, based on the budgets, and the information that gets plugged into value management should be based on when we receive equipment, when we receive product, or whenever the contractor says, I've done something, we can then update the value data. So if we re-baseline the plan, I would assume that all those things would need to be updated too. So it will be updated and documented in the project management plan, or should be updated in the project management plan.
Fantastic. So I've got another question here, and you've sort of touched on this a little bit, but the question I've got here is, can EVM work if it's added to a project after the project is well underway?
Not really. If you re-baseline it effectively, potentially. So I met a chap who was working for a credit card company a couple of years ago. It was on a course actually for at Nantwich I was doing, and basically his company had decided to implement value management halfway through several projects, and he was really finding it challenging to kind of manage, because EVM requires you to decide how you're monitoring your project in terms of progress. So you'll ask your contractors and you'll ask your stakeholders, what does 10% of your project look like to you? Because then once we know that, then we can monitor it. if we haven't asked those questions early on and we're halfway through a project, it's going to be very hard to work out, well, how much of this project have we actually earned so far then, if we haven't been tracking it. So it doesn't really work for a project if you plug it in halfway through. You tend to have to do it in the formative stages of the project, in the business case and PMP. You have to decide, we're going to use earned value management on this project. A lot of companies mandate it now. They say, right, we're using earned value management on our projects, and that's it. Defense does, for example, depending on the size of the contract, the size of the project, rather, the budget of the project, we have to use earned value management. And it's basically only the lowest level projects don't need earned value management in defense. All the others must track earned value management, and they must be planned around earned value management as well. Because it doesn't work very well if you plug it in halfway through. It just doesn't track properly, and it always kind of skews things, unless you kind of really it would require rebaselining and an extensive rebaselining to get it working. Okay,
good. So it seems to me like it's something that you need to build it into good project governance from the off.
Yes.
So it's whilst it can be great to kind of be halfway through a project and then suddenly decide that data is important, but I think it's important to kind of baseline what good looks like from the start, isn't it?
Ideally, yeah. It's basically you need to know. You should try and understand what systems and what tools you're going to use to track your project as early as possible, because if you just decide one day we're going to do something different to what we originally planned, there's a lot of implications around that in projects. Projects do change. That's the nature of them. They will almost certainly change as we progress, but changing how we're monitoring a project halfway through, that's going to be really problematic. It's going to be really tricky to do that. So it has to be done right. So you have to decide on it early on, I'd say.
Yes, I mean it's for me as a marketer, I'm often looking at data is very much built into what I do. So it's it's good to see that it is best practice to, like I say, know what good looks like from the start, and because how you measure it and what you measure might not be the same if you have to rebaseline halfway through.
Yeah.
I've had a question come through here, Callum, which is an interesting one, that says kind of all the examples that I've seen in textbooks are kind of straight lines for EVM. And many of my projects, which are IT based, have kind of stepped payments, and it's not always easy to accrue value. So sometimes the software has no actual value until it is completed. I think I've got a bit of experience with that myself. I accept agile development may be easier. Have you done a project like that?
So I've not worked I've never done an IT-based project, and agile would look at that, yes. So EVM doesn't really work on projects that aren't really linear, because agile is about, as you say, accruing value over time. You may not know what that value is until you finish it. That's the nature of agile. You alter the scope as you progress through the project. The question, have I done a project like that? No, I've consulted on projects like that. I've been around projects like that, but I've never actually ran a project like that myself, because in defense, all of the projects I worked were either linear or hybrid. So hybrid being a mix of agile or iterative and linear. So agile covers that sort of thing, and EVM wouldn't really work in an agile iterative project for that reason you've mentioned there, is that you don't know the value of something until it's finished. But it's hard to predict that value because you don't really know what you're going to get until you've done it. So yeah, EVM is for linear projects, or to an extent hybrid, depending on how hybrid they are. If the hybrid life cycle is mostly iterative with a bit of linear, I would say EVM might be a bit tricky to use in that one. If the hybrid is mostly linear with a bit of iterative, then the EVM strategy would work, or the tool would work better. But agile, I wouldn't use EVM in an agile IT-based project. It just wouldn't work in the right way.
Yes, no, I mean, that's a great answer. I mean, I think it's worth adding with agile, it's about that kind of course, incremental delivery of value early and often. I think in terms of agile, or rather the DSDM frameworks, kind of principles of kind of like high level planning. Once you start getting into the value of the low level work, then things can change quite rapidly, can't they?
Precisely, yeah.
Okay, so we've had a question kind of come in follow up on that. What do you feel would be best then for non-linear projects?
That's a tricky one. not EVM. Non-linear. Budgeting in an iterative project. I mean, the slides have been based primarily on linear here, really. In fact, not primarily, entirely on linear projects. Iterative, how we tend to do budgeting in an iterative. If you were to imagine, I can't draw anything at the moment, but if you had a graph, it wouldn't necessarily, an iterative project wouldn't tend to be a S-curve. If I just go back to the S-curve a second, so iteratives don't tend to use S-curves to monitor budgets. They tend to use, there we go. They tend to use bar charts. So if you're familiar with time boxing, so those 4-week periods where we basically do what we can, deliver what we can, then 4 weeks is over, move on to the next time box. We tend to budget based on time boxes. And with iterative, we are monitoring, we have a set amount for the time box. We say, this is a question in this one. We have a set amount for the time box. Say, right, this time box has been allocated that much money, that's it. Doesn't change, doesn't move, that's it. And with an iterative life cycle, that's driven by the idea that we have a fixed time and a fixed budget we should have a fixed time and a fixed budget for an iterative life cycle, which is basically saying, because going back to this earlier point regarding scope being flexible, so we don't really know what we're going to end up with at the end of the project. We have a few must-have requirements. We have an idea of the key things we want. We want a piece of software that does this and this and this. But beyond that, we're not entirely sure what it's going to look like. It might have additional functionality. We might find there's more requirements we could add to it as we learn more about what we're delivering, which means the scope must be flexible. But to avoid the project going on and on and on forever, we fix a time, we fix a budget. And then we distribute that budget to the time box and say, right, we'll allocate a bit to that time box, a bit to that time box, a bit to that time box. And we know each of those time boxes will last 2 to 4 weeks, which will then indicate how long we want to spend on the project. So we monitor using time boxing in an iterative approach. We don't use EVM. As I said, I can't imagine how EVM would work in an iterative project for that reason. So it requires more careful management of the budgeting based on an overall sort of kind of set budget. Change control can come into play quite a lot in an iterative life cycle as well, in the idea that if we have a must-have requirement that's not going to be met, that would be a cause to say, right, we need more money and time for this then. Whereas if it's a should-have or a could-have requirement, then we'd say, right, we prioritize the time and the money over those could-haves and should-haves potentially. But that's starting to go more into the other tools that are part of project management elsewhere, that one. Agile projects tend to use similar tools, but they just don't use EM. So requirements management, budget management, requirements management, scheduling. But the schedule is fairly straightforward because we know everything's going to take 4 weeks, 4-week chunks, time boxing. Yeah, it's a long answer to that one, I'm afraid.
Well, it sounds to me like a session on agile project management is something that will be quite popular. So do please stay tuned. We do have something on agile in the pipeline and in planning. So please do kind of keep in touch with us for updates on that. Okay, I've got another question here. So does EVM work on complex projects?
Yes, it does, definitely. So I know that the projects we use, the diagrams we use in this one are fairly straightforward, and I do use a simple project when I'm doing this topic in the PMQ courses. But it was invented by the Americans in the 50s, I believe, to monitor battleships, monitor battleship projects. So it was invented to monitor very complicated projects, and it is used mostly in very complicated projects rather than simple projects. It tends to be again, this goes back to the earlier point regarding how do we monitor it's quite complicated to monitor. If we just plug it in, we need to plan for it initially. If we plan for it initially, and we'd say, right, what does our product look like at the end, and how do we break that product down into its parts to work out how much we've done of it. Once we know that, then the project can be as complicated as we like. I mean, it's been used, I said we use it in defense, it's mandatory in defense. We used it on Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier and all sorts. It's been used in defense. Well, I hesitate to say effectively, but it has been used for years in defense, and it's been used for decades in the American defense industry as well. So,
fab. Fantastic. I've got one more question here, just to swing back onto budgets very, very briefly. The question I've got here is, who would generally oversee the budget management, have ownership of the budget, and how are escalations managed generally?
So the person who owns the budget is the sponsor. or should, I'll use the word should here, the sponsor should own the budget because they're the primary risk taker on a project. They're the ones who say to an organization, so they own the business case. Sponsor should own the business case. They're the ones who say to the business, here's an idea for a project that I've come up with or my team have come up with. What do you reckon? Do you want to give me some money to go ahead and do it? And their budgets will then allocate it to the sponsor to kind of distribute to the project manager. Who manages the budget? The project manager. So the project manager will so the sponsor comes up with an initial budget, or there's an initial budget in the business case that gets given to the project team and the project manager, who then work out, right, based on this budget, what do we need to do? They break down the project into its work breakdown structure, product breakdown structure, cost breakdown structure, organizational breakdown structure, and figure out what does this project look like in all its individual pieces. And then we cost up each of those individual pieces of work and those products. And then we can go back to the sponsor and say, right, here's the planned budget. We also then have a schedule, hopefully been developed by the project team as well. And this is how the budget will fit across the schedule. This is when we want to spend money based on the task being completed, when things are needing to be released, when we need equipment, when we need tools. And then the sponsor will then release money to the project team, should release. So the sponsor won't give the project manager, here's the budget, off you go, do what you want. It'll be the sponsor usually has to be give money to the project. They'll release money to the project at intervals, and those intervals will be based on the schedule the project team has come up with. But who owns the budget? Sponsor. Who manages it? Project manager and project team.
Fantastic. I think that is just about all the time we've got for questions today. If you wouldn't mind switching forward a couple of slides, Callum. I'd just say something very briefly about some of the next steps you might want to take in terms of achieving your PMQ, if that's something you're looking to get into. We offer a variety of different kind of learning options and study options. And like I say, we're one of the leading APM providers in the UK. With not just that, I've also got a little bit of a free demonstration of our online learning platform, which I've just popped into the chat for everyone. And for those of you who will be watching on YouTube, I'm going to also put that in the video description down below. If you want to find out anything more about us at Training Bytesize, or the courses we offer, or training, or if you have any further questions, don't be afraid to follow us on social media, get in touch with us. I've just popped some links into the chat, and I've also put them in the video description down below. This will all be made available on YouTube for you to watch and share as well. So don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. If you want to get in touch with us via email, you can always get in touch with us at learning@trainingbytesize.com, and I'm just going to pop that into the chat for you. There we go. And that will also be in the link in the video description. Fantastic. And there's only one more slide left to go. And that is just to say thank you. Thank you, Callum, for leading a fantastic session today on budgets, costs, and EVM. And thank you to all of you watching now and in the future for contributing some fantastic questions and really enabling us to really get the most out of the session. So yes, thank you very much. I hope you all have a fantastic weekend. And the last thing to say now, the very last thing, is to just inform you that on the 5th of May, the next episode of LightBytes is happening. Again, there'll be a link to sign up in the video description on the YouTube video, and you can also go to trainingbytesize.com/events. And the next session will be all about scheduling and the critical path. So that's everything from us today. Thank you once more, Callum. Thank you to everybody who has attended today's session. It's been absolutely fantastic to have you along. And we look forward to seeing you next time.
Cool.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.